Welcome to the Mission First People Always podcast. We're glad you're here. And now our host, Dr. Mike Patterson.
It's Dr. Mike Patterson, your host of the Mission First People Always podcast, where we talk about what it takes to be a great leader and how to build a great team. And today, I'm excited to be joined by a Hall of Famer. Now, he's not just any Hall of Famer. He's not enshrined for his athletic prowess, but for his distinguished service in the White House as a member of the White House Communications Agency. Darrell Williams has led over 500 White House missions, and following 9/11, he was selected as one of 5 key leaders to direct emergency action communications for the Vice President of the United States. And he did this on Air Force Two much of the time. As a member of the military, Darrell was awarded the Presidential Service Badge, and as an old Army guy myself, you don't see those a lot. You don't see people wearing those walking around very often. And so I think that's pretty cool. That's pretty special. And so in addition to that, Darrell has a number of other medals and awards, and he has served our country honorably for his entire military career, and now he's still serving. He's presently the Chief of Military Personnel for Operations at the Defense Information Systems Agency at Fort Meade, Maryland, where he supports nearly 500 members of the military from all branches of the service. He is also a professional speaker, a workshop facilitator, and a coach through Alliance Seminars Coaching. And I know this as well, and I hope he doesn't mind me sharing this. He's a sincere man of faith. Another important part of Darrell's story is that he was raised in Compton, California, and that's a city in South Los Angeles that's pretty infamous for its mean streets and gang activity. So I want to explore that part of Darrell's story a little bit with him as well. Now, I've known Darrell to be the ultimate encourager. He's a man who is always inviting the people in his sphere to do more and be more, and I'm excited to learn from him today. Darrell Williams, welcome to Mission First, People Always, my friend.
Mike, thank you so much for having me. I'm definitely looking forward to our time together.
That's great. I'm so glad you're here from Washington, D.C. Darrell, you worked in the White House, and that's a really, really long way from Compton, California. Did your young life in Compton influence your decision to join the Army? Tell us a little bit about that story.
So very interesting. When I grew up in Compton during that time, I believe it was the 4th most dangerous city in America. And as you said in the intro, definitely known for a lot of gang activity, drugs, things of that nature. Now, I always tell people, they had a lot of great people that have come out of Compton that did some great things, but unfortunately, those are the things that made the headlines. So for me, it was just a matter of, I knew there was something else out there, didn't know what it was, but I just wanted to tap into it. And the interesting thing was I had no plans to join the military. I had relatives that were in the military, but it just wasn't something that came to mind. And then going into my senior year, the summer prior to that, I ran into an Army recruiter. And rather than trying to really speak to him, I actually trying to just get past him, but he caught my attention anyway, and I couldn't shake him. And he started asking the general question, what are you going to do when you get out of school? And I was just coming up with anything. And once he started talking about college and how to pay for it, it was like that aha moment, Mike, where something was like, okay, I think you might want to listen to this guy. And once he started talking about how much college costs, and I knew oldest of 4, dad was, used to pick cotton before he moved to California, had a 6th grade education. My mom at that time was finishing up her high school diploma just so she could better herself. It was just one of those aha moments for me. It was like, okay, what are you going to do with your life, right? How are you going to pay your parents forward and be an example for your younger siblings? And once I listened to the recruiter, I was sold. I was like, you know what? I think this is something that I want to do. I wanted to do something in the business area. He was telling me that the Army doesn't have a business. However, there are certain jobs that lend itself to that background. So I ended up going in as an administrative specialist, which basically was a military human resources person. And that was really kind of how I got into the military. And again, next to marrying my wife, definitely one of the, second best decisions I ever made.
Sometimes God even uses Army recruiters in our life. So I think maybe he was an angel that influenced you in a particular way, and it's all paid off for the best. Let's switch gears. As you and I have talked about before, what makes your story particularly interesting to people is that you've gone places that most of us haven't. For several years, you went to work every day in the White House. And we're all curious about what really goes on in the White House. I mean, we see the images on TV and the news and we hear stories, but you had an important mission in the White House. Tell us a little bit about what your mission was, how you got there, and then we'll start talking about some of the leadership lessons you learned, but just what was it like and what did you do there?
Sure. So the best way I try to explain this is, obviously the White House has a lot of different groups that support the president, right? So I always call them the big three, right? You have the White House staff, which obviously takes care of his day-to-day schedule and things of that nature. You have the United States Secret Service, who, again, has control of all of the protection for him. And then you have the White House Military Office, which basically does a lot of the operational types of things that allow the president to do his job. And underneath the White House Military Office is the White House Communications Agency, right? One of the premier communication agencies in the world, and especially the crown jewel of all the military services. It's a joint service, which means you have Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine members as a part of this agency. And their main job is to provide communications or information technology support to the president, right? The vice president, others as directed, anywhere at any time through any means. One of the most exciting missions that anyone could have, let alone somebody from Compton that's joined the military. And it's kind of coded as we call it a special assignment, Mike. So not everybody can, first of all, even get in here because of the clearance, which a lot of people get upset. I ran into a lot of people say, hey, I put in for that job and they didn't pick me. I'm like, hey, it's not us, it's the Secret Service. They run the security aspect of who comes in and who doesn't. And what happens, Mike, is the White House Communications Agency has two missions, right? You have the in-town mission. So whatever your background was in the military, you still do that role. So since my background was human resources, I had a in-town mission, which was I provided the human resource support for one of the organizations within the White House Communications Agency. But then the other cool part about this is you have a travel mission. So that means if you're a satellite person or radio person or switchboard, you would perform that role on the road to basically mimic White House capabilities in DC, wherever the president or vice president or first lady is traveling to. And since my role was non-technical, which is so great, that it allowed me to travel in a leadership capacity, right? So when I traveled with the president, before I came onto the VP side, I was called, basically, it was like an operations lead. So you handle all the operations of getting the team to the trip site. Now, this is back in the day, Mike. So, this is when you had one credit card that paid for everybody's cars and rooms and logistics and all of those things, coordinating flight arrangements. And I was that person. You had a communications officer that really ran the whole show. But then you had myself, who was kind of like a military, like a first sergeant on the road. Basically, you handle all the people things, right? And it was just one of the best jobs that anyone could have because you have a guideline of things that you have to get done, but the broad perspective of how you do it is very open, which allows a lot of creativity, a lot of leadership, right? A lot of team building. And I traveled again with the president the first time as operations lead. I left the agency, came back, and then that's when I started traveling with the vice president. And in that role, it was a combination of the operations lead and that communications officer. So combined, I was what you would call a vice presidential communications officer. And you pretty much ran a 5 to 7 person team wherever the vice president went, to include overseas. And it's a great responsibility, but definitely a heavy responsibility because, again, whatever communications the vice president uses or his team, you are responsible for making sure that those assets work at all times.
So the mark of a leader, and I'm being funny here, is that you get the credit card, you've got the resources, you get to pay the bills, and I know that's just a small part of
right.
it, but that right. But the whole idea of holding on to that responsibility to keep one of the world's top leaders in constant communication. Was it stress? I mean, silly question perhaps, but how stressful was that? And how did you deal with the stress of that big responsibility? I mean, if the president or vice president needs to talk to somebody in the Kremlin or somewhere else in the world, that's your job to make that happen. How'd you handle the stress of that mission? Because a lot of people get stressed out at work, and their mission is not to keep the president in touch with world leaders. How'd you handle it?
So, very good question. It is definitely one of the most stressful jobs in the world. And a lot of that is, like you said, because of the responsibility. And I have to always tip my hat to all the military service members that make this happen, because the majority of everything that happens in this agency is done by military members. So the great thing about that is they already come in with a sense of pride, professionalism. They're the best of the best, right? And one of the things when I got to this agency, it was like, holy smokes. First of all, I got to make sure I don't do anything stupid, right? And I need to make sure, it's kind of like you want to prove yourself, like I belong here, right?
Right.
Because when you're in an agency like this, you have definitely more type A personalities than you do something else. And everybody's trying to be the best. Everybody's trying to make sure that last trip was the best, right? And then you kind of find yourself in a competitive, but a fun competitive way of outdoing the other person, right? So when I got there, one of the first things I did was the same thing I did when I first joined the military, and that was I had to find a mentor. Right. I knew that in order for me to be successful, I need to connect myself with people, with leaders who have been doing this for a while. But Mike, not just the ones that were doing it for a while, but I went to people and said, like, okay, who's like the best radio lead? Who's the best switchboard lead? It was quite a few of them. But once I kept that list together, I started seeing some of the same names. So I would make sure if I was in DC and I was not traveling, I would do, office calls with these individuals, and I would pick their brain, Mike. I would just say, hey, what makes a good switchboard lead? Why do you do what you do? And in my role, when I travel, what is it that I need to do to make sure you're successful? So that was the first thing I did. And then when I traveled with those individuals, I was fortunate enough to be on their trips, the same thing. I would pick their brain and just say, hey, tell me about the nuances of how you run your particular part of the trip, and why is your style so different than someone else? And it was so great, Mike, because not only were these individuals great at their craft, but they wanted to pass down that knowledge. And that's one thing I found out. Great leaders, great mentors want to pass on information to the persons that they see that reminds them of themselves. And every person I've met, they never said they were too busy. They never said, hey, get back with me later. The fact that I was willing to listen to them meant that, hey, I'm willing to download information, and as much as you want to receive, I will pass it on. And that was definitely one of the biggest ways, because I asked those leaders, like, how do you get, to the point where when the president calls, you're not nervous, or you have to give him a piece of equipment? And a lot of them had different answers. But the main thing was they were professional. And just like in any other industry, you have to trust your training, right? You train so much that after a while, when different things happen, it's just that second nature effect that you just go into a certain type of mindset because that's what you've been doing for so long. And then the other part of it is you want to do such a great job that you're always thinking outside the box. So as soon as you find out, Mike, that, hey, the vice president right, is on his fishing trip. And when he gets halfway down the river, he's going to want to make a couple of phone calls. You start going into this mode of, what piece of equipment I'm going to use, right? I have 5 different ways of making this happen. Which one is the best for this particular scenario? If that doesn't work, what's the second option, right? Third, fourth, and fifth as well, because you're always thinking worst case scenarios. If this happens, then I will do this. If this happens, then we will move into this mode. And once you just start playing those mind games over and over, the stress kind of goes away. It's still there, but it's not overtaking your decision making.
So, Darrell, you just rattled off about 6 really profound bullet points about leadership. And I want to just summarize and recap here to make sure, and we'll put these in the show notes to make sure folks have them. But some of the things you said about, I think my question was, how do you deal with stress in a high stress job?
Mm-hmm.
And you kind of just talked about leadership. You said, find a mentor, be eager to learn, ask a whole bunch of questions, find the best at their job, and pick their brains constantly. And you mentioned the healthy competition that was there, but it was about competition related to always raising the bar, always doing better, not making someone else look less efficient or less professional in some way. It was about making us all look more professional. You talked about trust your training, and you talked about thinking outside of the box and always having contingency plans. You also said something that I just want to follow up on. You said when the vice president calls or the president calls, what do you do not to be nervous? Did you really get calls from the president and the vice president, and how'd you respond?
So in my role with the vice presidential communications, not only did we get calls, I was a part of 5 other team members, right? We had 30 members that supported him away from the White House, right? So every time the vice president goes anywhere, right, there's one of these 5 people that are there that are on site when he arrives, normally about 7 days, or her now, right? 7 days before they get there to make sure all the communication is set up. And then after 9/11, right, the vice presidential role kind of took on a larger scale. And I was just really blessed and fortunate to be one of the 5 that they selected to be with him 24 hours a day, which means one of the 5 of us, right, we'd work shifts, right? Maybe we would be with him every other day or 2 days in a row, depending on the schedule. So we were actually with the vice president. So if he went to a place in town in DC, went to an event, we would be there representing the White House Communications Agency. Obviously, there'd be a Secret Service lead, there'd be a doc, right? There'd be a mill aide, and there'd be a VP staff person. And so we would be there all the time. So it wasn't even a matter of getting the call, but it was the military aide come to you saying, hey, Darrell, when we get to such and such museum, the vice president needs to make a couple of calls. And then those are those situations where, again, we would have certain tools to allow that to happen. And then if we were on a trip site outside of the DC area, I would have a counterpart that was there that already had that set up, but I would still have to be responsible to ensure, right, that call would take place on the equipment that they set up. And I would kind of oversee, those operations. The person on the trip was overall in charge. But once you step on that site, now you're there. But one of the key things that I would always do as a leader is I would tell them, like, hey, when I hit the ground and we land at your trip site, you do not work for me. I work for you, right? If the vice president needs something, let me help you with getting him to whatever that asset is. So show me where I need to go. Show me what's the best place to take him to do this call or to have this meeting, which the staff picks it out. But again, we have to do our part to make sure the comms is set. And to me, that was one of the best things that helped me was changing the whole mindset. Like when I got off the plane, right, it was like, I am now here working for you. What do you need?
So I think that's another key leadership lesson that we ought to highlight here, is that it's not about pulling rank. It's not about who your boss is. And maybe you could have played that president or vice president card with people. It's about an attitude of service and working collaboratively with people to get things done. That seems to be what you're saying is the key to success. Did I get that right?
You're exactly right. One of my primary mentors, even back in 1990, right, when I first came to the White House Communications Agency, and to this day, I have a lot of different mentors. And now, he says we're at the age where he's not my mentor, but we're colleagues. But in my mind, he will always be that mentor. Gentleman by the name of Steve Smith, who was one of the best communications officers in the history of the agency. And one of the lessons I learned from him on the trip I did, it was all about the people, right? He was always saying that mission first, people always, way back then. But he was saying, but we have to focus on the people always, meaning you're only going to be as good as your team, right? You're only going to be as good as you allow your team to be. And he just instilled it in us that, your job is to bring out the best in your team. So when you bring out the best in your team, everything else will take care of itself. And I tell you, Mike, one of the best stories I remember that he taught me was somebody made a mistake on the trip. And even though I knew, because I felt really close with him, that, he would confide in me in certain things. And I'm watching this whole process, Mike, like, man, this guy really screwed up. Like they could have sent him back home, right? And the way he handled it, Mike, he asked the guy what happened. He asked him why it happened. But then here's the great thing he said next, Mike. He said, what would be the next steps, right? He said, if you were me, right, and you had to give me advice, right, call back DC, don't worry about the mistake. What would be the next steps to fix it? And the guy came out with 3 steps right away, right? He said, okay, let's go ahead and make those steps happen on your end. I'll do my part. And Mike, when he called back to DC, he didn't tell them that the guy made a mistake. He said that I spoke with Darrell and a mistake happened, but here are the actions that Darrell recommended that I believe is definitely going to help us. So can you imagine when the person got back to DC, not knowing what they were going to hear, right, from their peers or their bosses, they heard the total opposite. Man, I heard you saved the trip. Mike talked about your recommendations. Great job. And then when that person went back to Mr. Smith and said, hey, sir, why didn't you tell them the whole story? His thing, Mike, was they didn't need to hear the whole story. They only need to hear the part of the story that was important.
Wow. What a wonderful lesson in grace. That's the word that comes to mind.
Yes, it was.
A wonderful example of grace, and also an investment in this person that will undoubtedly, or did undoubtedly, pay dividends for the future, because that person learned a lesson that day. Mm-hmm. He learned about what it means to be redeemed and trusted despite making mistakes, because we all make mistakes. We all fall short at times, but how we respond in the aftermath is what's really key. And that's a great leadership lesson right there. So I want to ask you, Darrell, what surprised you most during your time in the White House? I mean, you've seen a lot of stuff, probably a lot of it you can't even talk about.
Right.
But what surprised you? And maybe through the eyes of a leader, through the eyes of a member of a really important team, mm-hmm. What surprised you while you were on the job in the White House?
I'm telling you, one of the biggest surprises for me, Mike, is you never truly realize how impactful leadership can be in any situation. I mean, I've traveled through presidential campaigns, vice presidential campaigns, Air Force Two, overseas trips. The common denominator for every successful trip, Mike, was the leadership aspect of learning and knowing your people, finding out in a very short period of time, what are they good at, right? And how do you maximize that? And then what confidence, they already had a certain amount of confidence, but now what other confidence could I instill into them while we're on this trip? And that's one of the things that I love, because every trip you go on, it can be a different team, unless you're in a campaign and you're jumping, right? Which means you do one trip, jump to another trip and another trip. But to me, the fun part was always trying to, and and this is before assessments, right? Right, Mike. You just had to do it on the fly. Taking little notes, whether it was mental or whatever it was, like, oh, I traveled with Mike before. I know that Mike is good at X, and I also know that Mike has the capability of doing Y. And every trip, right, just pushing those buttons on those people, always capitalize on what they were good at, but also challenging them, right, to do something a little bit new, a little bit more than what they were used to, not to make them look bad or make myself look good, but to show them that, hey, as good as you are, there's another level of greatness inside of you. And just make sure that every trip you go on, every challenge that comes your way, you look at that as an opportunity to do that. So to me, that was the best thing, is the more you challenge people, and especially during hard times and challenging situations, the more they have a chance to step up to the plate.
I love the fact that you just affirmed, Darrell, something that I say all the time. And that is, one of the primary responsibilities for any leader is to bring out the best in the people around them. And you just describe that. We do that by getting to know people, getting to know the people on our team well, identifying what they do well, leveraging that, giving them opportunities to shine, soar with their strengths, but also to challenge them to grow and to recognize that potential that's there and to help them fulfill that. So I love that story. And I love the fact that what I've been telling people for a very long time, you've just affirmed for me. So I appreciate that. You were in the White House during the terrible, tragic 9/11 era that many of us still remember quite distinctly. And sometimes we learn the most about ourselves as leaders and the quality of our team during the most difficult times. And, many people would say that was probably one of the most difficult times in my lifetime that
Sure.
this country has gone through. So could you tell us a little bit about your experience during the darkest moments of 9/11, and you were, there close to the seat of power? What lessons did you learn then that maybe affected you as a leader, for the next 25, 30 years? What's still affecting you based on what you learned around that 9/11 period?
One of the biggest things I learned, Mike, was you can have all the capabilities, you can have all the resources and money. During those times, it does not matter. One of the biggest things that mattered during that time, people needed to know, did you care about them? Right? Because if you cared about them, then they were going to take care of whatever it is that you were going to ask them about. So just watching, our senior leaders at that time, right? It wasn't even about what do we need to do to position ourselves in case the president has to do X and Y. Yes, that did come up. The primary thing that came up was, how are our people? Where are they? Which accountability system do we need to kick into gear so that we can account for all of our people and find out how are they doing, and if there's anything we need to do to help them immediately. That was the biggest lesson that I learned about our people going through that particular time, because again, if you can imagine, when those type of things happened, it opened up a lot of things that people didn't realize needed to be closed, right? For example, just saying like airports, right? We didn't realize how loose we were. and airport access and things of that nature. So you had to tighten up those types of things to make it a little bit more secure. So the same thing we had to do from a communications perspective. How do we tighten up the communications for the executive office of the president? And what new tools and new ways of doing business do we need to implement to be even more agile than what we already were? But I would say that, again, none of those things were as important as letting the people know that, hey, for right now, we just need to know where is everyone, is there anything we need to do? And once they saw that their leaders cared about them from that perspective and not, okay, Mike, now that I know where you are, I need you to take this radio and go to XYZ place and stand by for further instructions. It was like they were glad to do those things. Once they knew that their families were safe, and we told everybody right now, it's not even about the mission. It's about just being safe, letting us know where you are, stand by for further instructions. And once people knew that, trust me, they were willing to, again, run through walls for you.
Leadership really is a relationship. And
absolutely,
you just confirm that. You just capsulize that idea in if people know that you care for them, that you see them, that you have their best interests at heart, once they get that, they're gonna willingly perform the mission. Yes. But first things first, we've got to care about our people. And that's the whole idea of my book and this podcast, mission first, but people always, they're inseparable. We've got to balance both. This is a question that's been on my mind, and I've been excited to ask you since I knew we were going to talk. Sure. You've rubbed shoulders with some of the most powerful people on the planet. You were in the White House over 3 administrations. And I think, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but it was the George H.W. Bush administration, the Bill Clinton administration, and the George W. Bush administration. So you've been around and associated with, and I've seen pictures of you glad handing with these really important people. Are there any lessons or from your observations, good or bad, for how important people, powerful people, people with significant roles in an organization, how they treat people, how they interact with people? What did you come away with just observing those folks in action?
Definitely a lot of respect. People respect your craft. They respect your expertise. Sometimes you have to go through some non-happy days, I would call them, because even though at that time you feel like the smallest person in the world, but once you get through that, and you learn a little bit about yourself, right? And then those important people also learn a little bit about yourself. It's like, hey, that's that Darrell Williams guy. Isn't that the guy that, my phone call dropped on, right? And you got to be able to kind of look past that and like, that was a mistake that happened back then, but now we have a greater way of dealing with that. And that's one of those things that I loved about that job, because you really had to have the mindset that whatever happened, good or bad, on the last trip in front of the president, in front of the vice president, you have to forget about it and just be in tune with the next. And probably one of the best leaders that I learned that from was one of our former commanders, Colonel Jake Simmons. And one of the things I loved about Colonel Simmons, he empowered the people, right? He was like, if there's a decision that needs to be made, make the decision, right? He's only asked that you make the decision based on the information that you have at that time, but never pause to think, well, what would Colonel Simmons do in this situation? He was like, no, what would Mike Patterson do? And then just make sure you have, whatever details you had at that time, be able to explain that, right? Especially if it didn't go well. And it was okay if it didn't go as well as planned, right? We can always support whatever that decision was, as long as we have the details and know how you thought about things and what made you come up with that. And it was just a brilliant lesson because, again, it's one of those few jobs in the world where if you mess up, the whole world can find out right then and there. There is no tomorrow, it's like for everybody to see. And even if the world doesn't see it, that presidential or vice presidential staff will notice it and can see it, right? But again, it's those great leaders that even if it was somebody on the team that made a mistake, right? You go to that senior person, whether it's the vice president, and say, sir, we got a problem. Here's what the problem is, and here's what we're doing to fix it. And I tell you, Mike, one of the things that I never wanted to hear, although I did hear it a couple of times when I supported the vice president on that 24/7 mission, was whenever he walked up to you and said, is there a problem? Because when he asked that question, definitely it was a problem, right?
Yep.
But you can't tell him, oh, no, Mr. Vice President, there's no problem. You got to be the best leader you can be. And that means, having integrity and say, yes, Mr. Vice President, this particular item, right, is not functioning the best way that it should at this time. But here's our plan moving forward. And by the time you come out of your next event, we're going to have this other piece of equipment set up. We're going to have the person online, and you should be able to do your call. And the thing about that, Mike, is you got to say that stuff with confidence. Right? You cannot, even if you are shaky, you can't sound shaky when you're talking to the vice president, right? Because he needs to believe and have confidence in you the way that you say it. And if you say it any other way, it's like, he'll go to the middle lane, be like, hey, I'm not too sure about this next phone call. Can you put a little extra attention on it? But if you come across very confident, the middle aide says, hey, how's everything going? Like, hey, it's good. And he goes, yeah, because I asked the vice president, and he said he felt pretty comfortable about making that call at the next location. I'm like, good. So those were those things that you have to learn to really, when you're traveling with or supporting anybody and those type of people, definitely confidence in your abilities, integrity, to be honest, even in the worst situations, Mike, but knowing that you may lose, right, the little small battle of, goodness at that time, but you will win the long haul war because they know that you were a person of integrity and that you still did your best to make that particular situation better.
Take ownership, take initiative, and keep moving forward. That's, I think, the message there. And I love that. Darrell, it's a new year. We're recording this in the very early part of January. And it's a time when people are thinking about what they're going to do differently in the new year that may bring them greater success, different outcomes in the months ahead. So give the listeners some advice. What should people start doing now or as soon as possible to make 2022 their best year ever?
I think two things, Mike, that those individuals could do, and I share this with a lot of people when I do leadership training and talk to organizations, and when they think about it, they're like, you're right. And those two things are, the first one is look at a need that needs to be met, whether it's your organization, whether it's your family, whether it's your community, right? Where is a need that needs to be met? Because when you identify needs, it requires a different part of you, and it forces you to possibly do some things or partner up with some people, right, that you maybe did not think about in the beginning. And then the second thing is, as you're trying to meet those needs, right, look at how do I maximize my gifts and my talents. There's something in everybody, Mike. I don't care who you are, what part of life you come from, what side of the tracks you were born on. There is something about you that is needed, right, in this world. I don't care where you are. And you're the only person that has that particular gift for that particular moment, whenever that particular situation comes up. So instead of worrying about pulling Mike down or being jealous of Mike's podcast or Mike's book, it's where do I meet the need And how do I maximize my gifts or talents when it comes to meeting that need? Because when you put those two things together, whether it's 2022 or any part of your life, you're going to find the results, the satisfaction that comes with that. It will be a feeling inside of you that, one, you're going to want to replicate because it feels so good and because it's genuine and because it was something that you didn't think about doing for yourself. And the good thing about that strategy, Mike, is people will find themselves in situations connected with people that they probably would not have met in 2022, but because they were trying to do the right thing for the right reason, it opened up doors to something else. So I think if they do those two things, try to meet a need, and then figure out how can you maximize your gifts while meeting that need, I think they're going to have a very surprising and rewarding 2022.
What a powerful message. I wish every young person, and for some reason I'm thinking about young people.
Mm-hmm.
I wish they could hear and embrace that message. We all need to hear that message because there are people in our communities, in our lives, probably closer than we think, that have some real unmet needs that we might be able to address in some small way by leveraging our own strengths and our own giftedness, and being willing to give to others is incredibly meaningful. It's satisfying, and really maybe the secret to success. So thank you for sharing that with us, Darrell. If people want to get in touch with you, how would they do that?
So they can definitely connect with me on Facebook through Alliance Seminars Coaching, and I'll make sure I'll send you the information for the show notes. They can also go to our website, allianceseminars.org, and I'm definitely on LinkedIn as well.
All right, and we will put all that information in the show notes. Darrell Williams, thank you so much for being part of the Mission First People Always Great Leaders and Great Teams podcast. I have so enjoyed our conversation, and I'm grateful for your service to our great nation. You probably hear that a lot. Sometimes we say it almost as a cliche, and I hope it never becomes just something we say, but it should be from the heart. Thank you for your service. Thank you for your friendship. And Darrell Williams, keep encouraging people because you're really good at it. So that's it for this episode of the Mission First People Always Great Leaders, Great Teams podcast. Please join us for another fascinating conversations with people who walk their talk about great leadership and productive teamwork.
Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you want to create a stronger, more people-centric and empowered culture for your organization, visit drmikepatterson.com.